You are asking taxpayers, you and me, to fund the pocket of the president. And for the BBC to be doing that, A, it would have to acknowledge that it felt that it was right to be settling. And B, your point, it is then contributing to the overall narrative, I think, that Donald Trump was never wrong.
And you just think, wow. So what we are doing is rewriting the history books.
The repository of truth, frankly.
And what the BBC has done is assist that process by this idiotic edit that took place and has allowed Donald Trump to go after the BBC.
The Newsagents USA.
It's Jon.
It's Emily.
And Donald Trump has seen an open goal. And when he sees an open goal, he goes for it. He pushes the ball in the back of the net. Or if we're using an American metaphor, if there is no defence, he runs to the end line and scores the touchdown. And that is what he's done with the BBC in its kind of appallingly slow response to the leak of information about the editing of this Panorama clip. And what it's done for Donald Trump is two things, and I think we should sort of try and disentangle both. One is it has strengthened his attacks on the media and his ability to kind of intimidate and to bully, which is what we've seen in the US media. But it's sort of, what better way to do it than to attack the biggest global brand in news media than the BBC? But the other part of this is the kind of steady rewriting of history about what unfolded on January the 6th. And we heard Donald Trump in that clip of the interview there talking about just how perfect that speech was on January the 6th.
So let's just try and untangle this, starting with where the BBC is on this. The BBC has apologised for the edit, concluding that it gave the impression that President Trump had made a direct call for violent action. And many would say that that explanation, that retraction hasn't come soon enough. But the US president has accused the broadcaster of having defrauded the public with that edition of Panorama. There are lots of questions swirling around this idea that the public were defrauded, not least how many of the public in America would have ever seen Panorama go out, whether it would have been shown in America. And I guess the bigger question is, could you say that the public were defrauded about something that they would have seen 4 years after the event itself? And it's probably worth bringing in a piece that the Bulwark have done on the AI tool. Trump's Truth Social is asked the question directly. Did people storm the US Capitol on January the 6th, 2021 because of Donald Trump? This is the Truth Search AI. Yes. Multiple official and contemporaneous records attribute the January the 6th, 2021 Capitol breach to a pro-Trump crowd mobilised around his false election fraud claims and pressure campaign to stop certification. So I think it's just worth dividing out those two things. One, which is, did the BBC unnecessarily slide together two bits of a speech that they shouldn't have done and give the impression in one sentence that he was directing people to go to the Capitol to fight? Yes, they did. Did Trump also encourage people right the way back through many, many weeks, along with people like Rudy Giuliani, the election-denying force around him, to fight to overturn the election of Joe Biden? Yes, he did. And so to Jon's point, I think that's absolutely clear that this is becoming something of a whitewashing exercise for Trump. He can go after the money, he can threaten the BBC, as he has done to multiple organisations in the US, but he can also rewrite and gently round the corners of what happened that fateful day on January the 6th, which was, let's not forget, the culmination of his election denying in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, and that sort of process has been going on aplenty. For a start, most of the people that were involved in the January the 6th attempted insurrection have been pardoned by Donald Trump, and a number more who were involved. You talked about Rudy Giuliani, pardoned this week.
Yeah.
Sidney Powell, the lawyer, pardoned this week. And so it goes on. Donald Trump thinks that January the 6th was nothing.
Wants to make that go away.
Donald Trump wants you to come away with the view that on January the 6th, a lot of really peace-loving, decent Democrats, small d, who wanted to uphold the rule of law, went to the Capitol with good intent and were just trying to protest peacefully about the stealing of an election by Joe Biden. I'm sorry, there is no evidence at all that Joe Biden stole the election. He won the election. Donald Trump won in 2016. Joe Biden won in 2020. Donald Trump won in 2024. There is nothing to back up these calls. But Donald Trump is rewriting history, and it extends to civil society as well, where the Smithsonian, the great museums in Washington, were told to remove an exhibit about protest in America and insurrection, which had a whole lot on what happened on January the 6th. And of course, that has to go because it doesn't conform. Has it gone? Yeah, and it doesn't conform with Donald Trump's view of what the events were. Now, the Smithsonian said there was some bad signposting on it or whatever, but it went. And you just think, wow. So what we are doing is rewriting the history books.
The repository of truth, frankly.
Exactly. And so, you know, and what the BBC has done is assist that process by this idiotic edit that took place and has allowed Donald Trump to go after the BBC. And what the BBC does now, faced with this kind of, you know, threat of litigation, $1 billion kind of, you know, suit, is remains unclear to me. I think the BBC has to fight it, but I mean, whether it will or not is another matter.
Yeah, just to put this in context for our US listeners, $1 billion, £1 billion, let's say, is about a third of the BBC's overall budget. If that ever came to pass, that would be the end of the BBC. The BBC, frankly, cannot afford to give up a third of its income to a billionaire president. But even if it was a much, much smaller sum, it is still incredibly sensitive because you are asking taxpayers, you and me, to fund the pocket of the president. And for the BBC to be doing that, A, it would have to acknowledge that it felt that it was right to be settling. And B, your point, it is then contributing to the overall narrative, I think, that Donald Trump was never wrong about this position, this election denialism. Now, maybe they, in the BBC's mind, maybe they are two different things. But in the president's mind, there will not be two different things. There will be one, and it will be the retelling of what happened on January the 6th.
And Donald Trump framing it as the BBC is part of the government. And a lot of organisations, big corporations in America, think they can't get their head around the licence fee. And so they do think that the BBC is a government organisation. It has a royal charter. It's the government essentially that appoints the chairman of the BBC. So the government does have a role in it. The British government, which at various times, and I'm talking not about the Labour government, I'm talking about all governments since the BBC was formed, have at various times wanted to shape the output and affect the news output of the BBC. I have never seen a government so happy to talk about the editorial independence of the BBC. This is nothing to do with us. This is not our fight with Donald Trump. We're not going to go anywhere near it.
We're so hands off.
So hands off. The
you
BBC
make the decisions.
You make this decision. Please don't make me have to get involved in this. And Keir Starmer in the House of Commons today was kind of asked about what about Donald Trump, and are you going to push back and you're going to tell Donald Trump to get lost? Keir Starmer was just running a mile from it because this government doesn't want to pick a fight with Donald Trump. BBC, you're on your own here. Don't ask us for help. But what has happened with the BBC has seeped into American public life. You know, it's not just Donald Trump who's going on about it. There is this little-known podcaster called Joe Rogan, who's rounded on the BBC as well.
He's the president, and you're lying about what he said publicly, which is on the internet, which anybody can see. Like, it is the clearest, like, indication of how that woke shit was rotting people's brains. And is still, but just less. You know what I mean? It was like it was on the march then, and they all felt like they had to go along with it. And so, and by any means necessary, we must make sure that, so they decided to paint a different version of what he said. And they're fucked now. They're fucked.
BBC?
60 Minutes did it with the Kamala Harris interview, but they did it the other way. They made it look like she had a good answer. which is like, it's so crazy. Like, you guys are supposed to be the news.
Right.
You're not supposed to be the propaganda arm of whatever party you support. This is nuts. This is fucking nuts. And BBC is always like the one you quote when you want to seem smart. I was watching this thing on the BBC. Oh,
Yeah.
dude, you watch the BBC?
I love his British accent.
Yeah.
I mean, was that a British?
I think it was British, but it was someone who was trying to sound sophisticated, because if you watch the BBC, of course, you are incredibly sophisticated. But I mean, look, the impact this has now is that, I mean, my successor in Washington, Sarah Smith, for the BBC, is saying she doesn't know whether the BBC will in future be allowed to go to, you know, kind of a
The Oval
spread.
Office or
the
the
Oval
White
Office,
House
or be on Air Force One as part of the reporting team. You know, so the BBC could get banished because of this. This is big stuff, and it makes any foreign broadcaster. And let's face it, the foreign broadcasters don't have a dog in the fight. They want to hold, you know, power to account.
Well,
and they're being intimidated.
Yeah, and maybe we can play this clip from GB News last night, where Trump's lawyer appears on and is asked directly what Trump's view is of both the BBC and GB News. So, as ever, there are vested interests here trying to get the president on side.
He's fond of GB News, and I think he appreciates the treatment that he receives on GB News, and we hope that it will continue to be fair and accurate reporting.
Just finally, what's your message? What is the president's message to the BBC right now? The executives will surely be watching this interview tonight on the Late Show Live. What's your message to them? What's the president's message to the BBC right at this moment?
I think the message is fairly transparent in that the president will hold accountable those that transmit false and fake information. He believes that there is an institutional bias that's been reflected in the reporting about him, that there has been a lack of impartiality with respect to the reporting that has been engaged in. I think that there's been an intentional ignorance of evidence of bias within the BBC that needs to be remedied through governance arrangements that are fair and appropriate. And I think that those are the messages that we're trying to convey to them at this point in time.
So you've got those who feel that they are now in favour with the president, exploiting this for everything they can. And you have a lot of other journalists, and I don't think it will be just in the UK, but it will be around the world now, thinking, do we have to alter how we cover what he does next? Do we have to alter?
I love the idea that the guy says, God, how much do you love us? How much do you?
A bit more. Go on. Just spell it out.
Just spell
really?
it out.
Is it
really?
just me? When the president's watching the Late
much?
Show?
Oh,
yeah.
fantastic!
I mean,
so
GB News, as we know, is just starting up in the US, right? So there is every reason why they want to get the president on side at this point and become the primary, you know, the sort of
they're going to be
Fox News of.
Yes,
the UK.
Exactly. Or the Newsmax.
Or the Newsmax, or the friendly one.
Yeah, exactly. The friendly one. And they're positioning themselves very well. And you know, GB News is doing it very effectively. And that is why, you know, the GB News audience, I suspect Samir Shah and Tim Davie weren't watching GB News last night when that interview aired. But I think that they are very aware that, you know, GB News really matters now and is really an influential voice on the right in British public life. And that is what GB News has succeeded in doing. Well, the BBC has a barrel load of legal problems right now as a result of that Panorama and Donald Trump's threatening to sue. And we're joined in the studio now by Andrew Weissmann, who, US Attorney, former FBI General Counsel, was deputy to Robert Mueller. I want to come to the BBC bit first of all. Sure. And Donald Trump is saying, I want to sue in Florida. Why?
So if you followed the case where Jack Smith was bringing a criminal indictment with respect to classified documents.
That were being held at Mar-a-Lago.
Exactly. That case was brought by Jack Smith in Florida because that was sort of where the venue was. But there is a judge there who is extremely favorable to Donald Trump and who Donald Trump has repeatedly called out and praised. She issued a series of rulings that were very controversial. She was reversed twice by the higher court overseeing her for ruling in Donald Trump's favor in ways that were really as the court found, inappropriate. So Florida is viewed as, I think, by Donald Trump as a place where he could get both a very favorable judge and perhaps a favorable jury.
A safe space.
Exactly. And that's why you see what's called in the United States sort of forum shopping and judge shopping, something that shouldn't happen. But that, to me, would be the reason that he would seek to bring a case in Florida. That being said, I think he's going to want to have British law apply if he brings this suit, to say to the Florida court, you should apply the law of England, not United States law, because
Can he do that? I mean, what does that mean?
I mean, so it is possible. This is not my area of expertise, but it is possible to, when you go to court, to say you should apply the law of a different jurisdiction, and that should govern. And the reason to do that is that American law sets very high thresholds for somebody who's in the public eye, like Donald Trump, to be able to win that kind of defamation suit. My understanding of British law, again, I'm an American lawyer, not a British lawyer, is that it is more receptive to those kinds of lawsuits by public figures.
So if this came to trial in Florida, in the US, as a defamation suit, could he win?
He could win. I do think that it is worth noting that even if he could establish liability, and my understanding from reading the newspapers here in England is that that there was an error made, and that the BBC, I think quite honorably, is recognizing it. But that's not the end of the equation. One of the things that has to be determined is whether it was intentional or not. But even more than that, what are the damages? And I think that is an area where I would think that Donald Trump might have a very hard time in any jurisdiction establishing that just because of the splicing of what he said at the Ellipse on January 6th, showing that actually caused somebody to change their views of Donald Trump in any material way. Because that's sort of going to be one of the questions for a jury, even if they find liability, is were you really hurt by it? And so you could imagine a kind of verdict where the jury comes back and says, we'll give you $1. That it's a symbolic gesture, but it's hard to see that he would truly be hurt by this unless he could really prove some sort of systemic bias, that this is something that happened because of something that is emblematic of what the BBC stands for, as opposed to just something that's aberrational.
And how do you prove the mens rea? How do you prove that there was motive to make him look bad? I mean, that's presumably what's at the heart of this, right?
Well, so in the United States, there is an extensive discovery procedure. And so it's sort of very painful, but both sides are entitled to take what's called depositions. That is, that you have somebody under oath, and before the trial, the lawyers get to ask a lot of questions. They also get to look at documents to see what happened. And so here you would interview the people who were in charge of the program, who made the decisions as to how it should air. You'd look at contemporaneous documents to see what they said about it, to see whether it was just, an inadvertent error, something that people really didn't think about, to try and portray him in one way versus the other. Or they might have just thought it was accurate, even though it was something that in retrospect they thought was was a mistake. And so all of that is both a painful process, but that's sort of how you get to evidence, whether direct or circumstantial, as to whether somebody did this with sort of, a bad motive.
The interesting thing is, if you look back to the first term, Trump's first term, there were two successful cases brought by Melania Trump where she sued for defamation. And they were both British news outlets because, of course, Britain wouldn't enjoy First Amendment rights in the way that an American would. So she sued the Daily Mail and she sued the Daily Telegraph, and both of them kind of realised that they were on very sticky ground because they did not have the First Amendment protections that, say, an ABC or a CBS or a New York Times would have. And so, I suspect Donald Trump, what does it take to get Donald Trump to climb down? Do you think this will go ahead? Because he's issued a warning shot so far. He hasn't actually issued a suit.
I don't know the answer to what it would take in the United States, if this is any sort of prognostication of where sort of his mindset. He has both threatened and brought these kinds of suits, whether it's CBS, ABC. But of course, in those situations, he has not just a potential lawsuit, he has leverage. In that with those, particularly CBS, let's take that as an example, people have, I think, strongly speculated that the ownership of CBS had a real interest in settling a lawsuit. So, you can analogize this to kind of extortion, meaning I'm going to bring a suit regardless of its merit because there are a lot of reasons that a company has to settle that suit. Now, to be fair, there can be legitimate reasons to settle a suit for all of the reasons I said, that you don't want to have that sort of extensive discovery, that you don't want this dragging out. You want to turn the page. You don't want to put all of your people through all of this. And if you made an error, you sort of want to make amends. But I do think the issue here is not just liability. It really is damages. It is very hard for me to see that the sort of BBC mistake, the admitted mistake that they made, is something that would actually have caused damages. And let me just contrast that with a defamation suit in the United States where Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, who were two black poll workers in Georgia who were accused by Rudy Giuliani and then many others of having deliberately tampered with the Georgia election in that state for the presidency of the United States. And they won tens of millions of dollars because they were able to show not just that it was false, but just how much they were hurt, and testified about how the death threats, about moving, about just how much, just from being a government worker doing your job to have a fair election, how much their lives were completely turned upside down. I don't see Donald Trump being in that kind of position.
But do you think he's right to pick the BBC up on this? Do you think he's right to go for legal action?
So what I would say on that is, if you're a public official, whether it's in Britain or the United States, you should be respecting the role of the media, and you should expect that you are going to be subjected to increased scrutiny, and you should be, and you should welcome that. And a lot of times it's something where you may not like how you're being portrayed, and you might think there's even an error. But even if you were right here, and the BBC is saying they made a mistake in how they did that, I think that when you're a public official, you have another role that's not about you as a person, but the message you're sending in terms of respecting that kind of scrutiny in a democracy. So I think there's a real downside if he was thinking about sort of his role as president, as opposed to how he might personally feel if he were a private individual, particularly where there are no damages. I might feel differently if the BBC had made a mistake and was not admitting it. But here, I have to say, as a foreigner looking at Britain, it seems like somewhat of an overreaction, because I think that it's admirable when somebody makes a mistake. What you want, whether it's a public official or a news organization, that they're holding themselves to account for what happened.
You talked about respect and having more respect, and some would say that people who served in the Department of Justice are also deserving of respect along the way. And you came onto the podcast a few weeks ago, since when Donald Trump has been speaking, and about you as well. Can we just play this clip and get your response afterwards?
Deranged Jack Smith, in my opinion, is a criminal. And I noticed his interviewer was, I think that was Weissmann. And I hope they're going to look into Weissmann, too. Weissmann's a bad guy, and he had somebody in Lisa, who was his puppet, worked in the office really as the top person. And I think that she should be looked at very strongly. I hope they're looking at Shifty Schiff. I hope they're looking at all these people. And I'm allowed to find out. I'm allowed to, I'm, in theory, the chief law enforcement officer.
What does that mean, Andrew?
Bad guy.
So there's so much to say here. One of the things that I've particularly deplored and try to encourage the media, because I do a lot of legal analysis in the United States, is to make sure that we subject, when we're reporting, people to have to give facts and not just give adjectives and adverbs. So in the clip that you just played, there are a lot of adjectives, but there are actually no facts. That particular clip happened the day after UCL, the University College London, released the full video of an interview that I did with Jack Smith, who came and spoke for about an hour. People can go on YouTube and listen to it. They can make their own assessment of that interview. And so it's notable, talking about the First Amendment, that we were talking about free speech, that this is a comment that Donald Trump made in the Oval Office with the head of the Justice Department present, the head of the FBI present, the number 2 at the Justice Department present, saying that he would like to see people investigated. And it seems to be, and he refers to the interview that happened just the day before. So to me, that shows a real disrespect for the First Amendment. Going to your question from a moment ago about sort of what is the proper role of politicians in attacking the press.
I mean, just let me ask you something more broad, a bit broader. You've worked closely with Jack Smith, the special counsel, the man who was bringing the indictment against Donald Trump over his actions on January the 6th of 2021. I mean, when you see Trump's actions now against the BBC, do you think, OK, fair dues, he wants a mistake corrected and he's willing to come after them to make sure it never happens again? Or do you see a man who is trying to rewrite the history of that whole event?
So, so one, let me just mild correction. I mean, I've worked with Jack Smith in the past. I obviously didn't work with him at all in connection with his work investigating and then prosecuting Donald Trump. I think the answer is I kind of see both. And that I think that there's no question that Donald Trump in the United States is doing a whitewash of history. I mean, let me just give you one incontrovertible fact. He has pardoned every single person who was charged in the January 6th case, including people who physically assaulted law enforcement, people who defiled the Capitol in the most revolting ways, the most unpatriotic ways. All of those people have been pardoned, including people who, as been reported in the press, who have gone on to recidivate and commit additional crimes even after being pardoned. So there's no question there's a whitewash that's going on, and he has talked about January 6 prosecutions as a great tragedy in the United States. I mean, who could possibly think that when we all could see with our own eyes and hear on January 6 what was happening at the Capitol? To, I think, everyone who's patriotic had that sort of reaction. By the same token, I mean, the press should be held to account, and so that's why I sort of differentiated what my view is. If the BBC was not taking responsibility, then you might feel, you know what, legal action might be necessary at that point, because why isn't the media acting responsibly? But when you have a responsible media actor, I really think that somebody who's in a position of power really needs to be thinking twice about how they're going to use it, because the free speech is such an integral part of a thriving, healthy democracy.
Andrew, I just want to ask you, Emily asked you a more general question. I want to ask you a more personal question. You hear that clip from the Oval Office, that he's a bad guy and ought to be investigated, and he's doing that in the presence of the Attorney General and, as you say, the head of the FBI. And what does that make you feel? What does it make your family feel?
So, it's not the first time that Donald Trump has said things like that about me, and just to be fair, about lots of other people who are much more exalted than I am. The reason it is more targeted and sort of it has a greater impact now is that there was a time when those kinds of attacks were just words. And as shocking as it is to hear that somebody who's the president of the United States, like we like to say, the leader of the free world, saying things like that, you sort of knew there was going to be no action taken. But with the prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James, who are perceived enemies of the president, you actually think, oh, there are people who are willing to carry out those words, even when the facts and the law don't support it. So to me, it is obviously it's not a good thing to hear, but it is such a reflection of where the United States is as a country.
But do you know whether you are under investigation? Do you know whether any steps have been taken?
No idea. I certainly haven't been contacted.
And what do you think happens?
I have no idea. That's one where I sort of lead my life on the, you sort of take each day as it comes. I have to, be true to myself. When I left the Department of Justice, I ended up deciding that I was going to be a legal analyst. I was going to go on shows like this and work for MSNBC and NBC to try and explain legal issues to the public. Mostly in the United States, which is within the area I know about. And I'm going to continue doing that until someone tells me I can't.
Andrew Weissmann, thank you so much. Thanks for coming in.
You're welcome.
And just before we go, House Democrats in the US have released new emails to and from Jeffrey Epstein that reference Donald Trump quite extensively. And in a way, I would suggest that the White House will not be overly happy about.
This is a new batch of emails. It's been released from Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. And in them, we understand Jeffrey Epstein wrote that Donald Trump knew about his crimes. In 3 emails released, Epstein apparently told Ghislaine Maxwell, now serving a 20-year sentence in prison, that Trump spent hours at his house with one of Epstein's victims. There were 2 other emails to the author Michael Wolff, who's written several sort of biographies and commentaries about Trump and his presidency. And Epstein wrote that, of course, he knew about the girls. He, we understand, being Trump. According to those exchanges, Epstein was also asking Wolff for his advice. How should he handle Trump? What should he say about the interview? He was going on CNN to talk about their friendship. And apparently, this is what we are now seeing from the tranche that's been released, Wolff says, I think you should let him hang himself. If he says he hasn't been on the plane or to the house, that gives you a valuable PR and political currency. You can hang him in a way that potentially generates a positive benefit for you. Or if it looks like he could win, you could save him, generating a debt. Now, this is the kind of rumour that has always followed Epstein around. What was he doing? Was he picking up compromat material? Was he going to use very powerful men in ways that would actually help him generate a debt? I have to say, Michael Wolff doesn't come out of this tranche of emails very well at all.
And as we sit here recording this right now, there's been no comment from the White House. If I was to guess what that comment might be, I would say fake news and a hoax. We'll be back next week. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents USA.